Hey everyone, I'm glad to see a good group assembling here. Sounds like I keep hearing the chime as people are joining, so that's good. I know it's hard here at this time of day to get everybody at the same time, but we've got a great group so far, it looks like. So thank you all for joining us. So real quick, just I'm Eric Byron, and I've been around Agile and IT roles for decades, a long time. So we won't belabor that point. And no, I'm not in Wuhan or wherever this background is from, but I did take that picture myself, and I decided it looked much nicer than my little home office. So I hope you enjoy the scenery here as we do this. So Karlijn, can you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us who you are and what you're
So
doing.
I'm Karlijn, Belgian native, currently working in Hong Kong. A little bit like you, I've been working in IT, well, not for decades, a little bit less. Started in IT, moved to the banking world, did strategy and ops changes. And along with that journey came my agile journey. So yeah, that's me.
Okay. Well, let's dig into your background a little bit here, since we're going to talk about agile and building agile companies. So how did you learn agile? Where did your journey start?
Well, obviously, when you start I started as an IT consultant, then agile becomes quite natural to the world. At that time, the company I worked for was not so much pushing agile ways of working, but more on, how do they call it, aligning IT with business, meaning they were really kind of like bringing an offering on making sure that what IT delivers matches more with actually business needs or the product needs.
Mhm.
So that, of course, rings or smells like agile. And then the financial crisis hit, so around 2008. And then a big driver was then to speed up, deliver more, faster, create value. Again, something that sounds very much like agile, but at that time it was never really mentioned agile. We just kind of like, I call it common sense agile. Just naturally you kind of like go into those habits and different ways of working. I think I only became very much aware of agile and the ways of working, the best practices, that whole global community, when I started working for ING. I think people in agile know that ING ended up being one of those leading big financial companies implementing agile globally for all their functions. So my journey working for ING for, I think, 8 years, 7 years, was growing with them in their agile journey. I ended up also working for the transformation office, changing their portfolio, the strategy. So that's kind of like how I learned agile and became a fan.
Good. Well, I'm glad you kind of framed it that way, because I'm afraid people tend to think of agile as, a project management
Mm.
approach, right? And yes, agile is more than that, can do a lot more than that, and applied to a whole organization is much
Yeah.
more powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds like you got to experience that.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of it was trial and error too. If your experience was anything like mine, it wasn't
Yeah.
all rosy and smooth.
Never. No.
Yeah. So let's put some definition around agile here, and we talk about an agile company. And what
Mm.
does that mean, and how might we distinguish an agile company from a company that isn't so agile?
Mm.
How does that look?
Well, for me, I think the core of an agile company is being able to pivot, to adapt and adjust whatever they were planning to do based on what is the feedback from the market. So I am a believer that agile is a product strategy. And I think nowadays with COVID, it also kind of like, yeah, of course. But before that, before COVID happened, I think a big change in the markets that we see happening, that I experienced, was that, your customer becomes more and more vocal on what they want. You have more and more these startups, and this is the community that are challenging big corporates. So before, whatever the big corporates gave you as a customer, you kind of like had to receive and just be unhappy with it often. slow improvement, slow operational processes, slow customer service processes. And as that challenging happens by the customer, big corporates had to change, had to find way to adapt faster to that. So for me, it's all about an agile company. I would call it as a company that can pivot fast, which as a startup sounds obvious, but when you're a big corporate with lofty financial roadmap process, risk, legal compliance, shared IT, that is not so obvious to pivot fast, to act fast. So for me, that is the core of the definition. How you achieve that, of course, you have many, many best practices in the market, but I think every company needs to make their own version of that.
Yeah, an interesting analogy to that ability to pivot thing that I kind of learned as I was coming up, and I worked mostly in big corporates, was that idea of a large vessel, right? So you think of the bigger the boat, the harder it is to turn, right, and change direction. And the faster it's moving, the harder it is too. So even a small vessel moving really, really fast, it's hard to pivot, right?
Yeah.
But that's a great kind of way to, if you have to pin it on one factor, right? Being agile means the ability to change, adapt, pivot, as necessary. Yeah. Cool. So you're in this company, and company has realized, we need to pivot. We're not agile enough. How do you get started? How do you introduce, practically, right? What are the kind of steps you have to take once you believe you have a need to be more agile? How does that look for companies?
In my experience, typically you need to start with pockets of change, of just starting with the agile way of working. Very naturally, it starts with IT. In my experience, I have not seen it start elsewhere, and maybe that's just my experience. So I would be curious to see if anyone in the audience has seen it originating elsewhere. But typically, it starts with IT, small pockets, teams who start with agile. What I think is a critical success factor is don't stick too long and just doing the back end or the infrastructure type of changes in an agile way, but move fast to including your front end facing IT, so your customer facing IT, and definitely add to that your product team or your business team, and really focus on creating that co-located one team, creating value together. I think that is something I have seen several times here in Hong Kong, where we're very agile, but it's kind of like it stays with the back end or the second layer IT, as I call it, the supporting IT. That is then something to duplicate, so create several of those pockets, I would say. And if they are successful enough, and if that can show that you are creating value for your customer fast while being in this environment that you work on, I think naturally you go into need of some kind of product increment planning. I think that is a very heavy word. So often I would use kind of like a beat of the drum. If you have several IT teams working in the same cadence of sprints and releases, that will start setting a beat of the drum. You will have friction at that time with every other process that is not aligned with that beat of the drum. But if you're creating customer value, if you're creating value for the company, you have a leverage there why the rest need to follow. I think typically at that time, again, in my experience, you will see like transformation offices or COEs pop up, this need for a bigger support for a broader agile transformation, where I think, empowering the teams who actually do the work is really key. So that is typically how I have experienced it, which I think works. That is also my experience in ING. I think many people actually know of the ING Agile transformation when they decided to do the massive global change. But actually before that, and I've experienced that, they did actually test with several teams in several countries that had already an agile way of working for many, many years. Yes, in IT. And that was my experience. Depending on the project I was doing or the program I was doing within ING, I would go back to a little bit more waterfall or in a very agile team. So it was very interesting to kind of like experience those different flavors and see how, if you create value, if you show and you prove it has a value, the rest will follow.
Awesome. Yes, I've had some similar experiences, and with it starting, either in IT or at least in like product development groups. But there are challenges, particularly the bigger the organization and the more bureaucracy there is. Even your agile teams, they can't really deliver if the supporting organization, right, is still on, as you say, a different drumbeat, right? You may want to go fast and be able to change quickly, but if finance and marketing and all these other groups can't keep up, so at some point, it does have to start to catch up, and everybody's got to get on that same beat. IT can only take the transformation so far.
Yes, and that is definitely the moment where you have friction, and where when you are part of that leading agile team, the trailblazer, I kind of like, you need to take them in your journey. You kind of like need to help them understand their processes, help them in helping you, even though you don't yet have your official big agile transformation. I think if you show you create value, if you're fighting for the same thing, which is that product that is creating value for your customer, if you bring it like that and not just I want, then I think you can do a lot. Avoiding those frictions and solving those frictions.
Let's talk about company culture. I always like to say, and I'm sure you've used the phrase too, that agile is a mindset, right? It's not just a set of practices, right? It's a mindset. But company culture, can vary obviously, radically, and depends on industry and how regulated it is, and if there's life and death decisions being made, versus, oh, we're making video games where I came from, right? The culture can be very, very different. There's also a difference between kind of Western style companies, if you will, Western culture, and Asian culture, in terms of agility and transforming to be more agile. What's your experience there, observations about the influence of culture?
Since moving to Asia, so before working in Hong Kong, I worked in the Philippines. Since moving to Asia, I have realized that Agile is very Western inspired. Speak up, servant leadership, those things I think are not as natural in an Asian culture, which I learned very much the hard way in Philippines, where I felt like, gut feeling, I can't apply the things that I'm so used to applying in Europe. And it was only when I did some meetups here in Hong Kong on really deep diving on that, on using actually some design techniques, on unpacking the problem, that I learned to kind of like name it. I think, Asian culture, and I do realize I'm generalizing, so I do hope people in the audience can nuance it where necessary. But I learned that in Asian culture, it's very much a group mentality. I remember when I first joined my current project, we were looking into rewarding people, which is, an individual, like, to kind of like boost the competition, innovation and whatnot, where I realized, no, you have to do it more on team level. Like, nobody wants to shine out. It's a team effort. The safety is created in the team. I think also learned about servant leadership in Asia, for example. The boss idea is still very important, which is a cultural thing. It's just how people are raised. There's no value in that. There's no positive or negative. It's just a culture. But if you come in with your very much Western way of doing agile, then those are things that just won't fly here. So I do think, having now this different experience, that agile is in its origins very Western. So you do in applying and finding your own version of agile, you need to realize that a little bit, that certain concepts, certain things you need to implement differently here. and definitely, creating that trusting environment as a leader, but still being that leader that is necessary in Asian culture to have respect while empowering your team. I had to learn to do differently in Asia, here in Hong Kong, than what happens in Europe. I think in Europe, people speaking up and sharing their opinion is no issue at all. While here, I kind of like had to create that stage differently, for
Yes,
example.
yeah,
So I think
I agree.
it's there. You need to be aware of it. You need to adapt to it. So again, Agile is not a set of ceremonies, practices, and whatnot. That's just the best practice. You have to make it your own based on your culture, regional, company culture, and what you want to achieve. And I think that is the real challenge of Agile and doing Agile.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about startups and Agile,
Yeah.
because I think, when you're early on, right? I mean, Agile, it's a pretty natural thing, right? You're trying to figure things out. You're not really setting your plan. You're expecting to learn and adapt. So Agile's, pretty natural fit for a very small startup. Although culturally, you also have founders that come from big corporate and maybe aren't so used to it, and it freaks them out a little bit. But I think that it's pretty easy with a little bit of coaching to have a small startup be very agile. But as they grow, this is not a natural thing I've seen, right? So I'm curious, kind of your thoughts on that stage of growth when you need to maybe not be quite so agile, or agile with a little more structure. How do you recognize that and begin to build the structure you need to scale without losing your agility, right? So you find that balance.
Yeah.
What's your experience there?
I think I see two pitfalls, mainly by not having attention to your ways of working as you grow. So in my opinion, Agile is really like a product delivery or a product strategy. And typically a startup is there to create a new product or to solve a problem for a customer. So it starts naturally. If you're successful, you'll scale, and naturally ways of working will exist, be with 3 people or be with 5 people or 10 people. Ways of working will happen. I think the key is to find that balance by defining them early enough, in a very agile way, just in time, just enough, that you still control them, because otherwise you'll end up as this, mid-sized company who needs to go through a ways of working improvement as many of the big corporates want to do. So you want to avoid that. So I think step one, that's for me a pitfall. Pay attention to it. Agile never says that you don't plan. The more people you have, the more planning you need. It's just enough, just in time. That is the key. So you don't need to go to the other extreme. I think secondly, many of the startups, when they're successful, they start working together with big corporates, where you will have that massive big difference. You being your nimble, fast-moving startup with less documented, with less rigid structures, and you're communicating with a big corporate. I think that is the second biggest pitfall, where as a startup you will have to deal with that. Working together with corporates is the reality of a successful startup, or most successful startups. So having then that knowledge and understanding how those processes typically work, and again, then bring into that corporate your agile way of working, that is just enough for your startup. I think a corporate would learn of that. A corporate would happily follow suit, but often it's all not defined, and then the corporate will impose their heavy processes on you. So I think it's you probably most typically you are already agile just by nature of why you started as a startup. I think when you scale, the mistake might be that you don't put enough attention on your ways of working, ensuring that you maintain your agility by defining some base structures, and as you grow, reviewing them enough and make the structures and the ways of working work for you, to avoid these transformations that big corporates need to do, because that's painful.
Great points there. I just want to highlight a couple of the things you said there. You said, just enough, just in time,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's, really, really important that, we adjust, as we go, but we don't make, radical changes, right? But I think that it's really important that you recognize why you're agile and what it means to
Yeah.
your organization, so you don't lose that. So it's really intentional. You don't take it for granted, right? And then you'll be okay as you scale. If
Yeah.
you say paying attention to it, right? Don't
Yeah,
take it for
exactly. And
yeah.
there's such a drive on, creating value and features and whatnot, and I understand that, but if you lose that momentum of paying attention, you will need a revision project and correcting project, which
Yeah.
might be more
Yeah.
painful. Yeah.
I'll also comment that startups can have a challenge sometime depending on their investors too. So they
Yes,
may
that is
have
true.
this great nimble, we're wild and crazy, fast and furious here, and we're pivoting all the time. And you can have an investor that's going, whoa, 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 slow down there. You got to check with us before you change stuff now, because
Yeah.
right,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, that can
Yeah.
cause some friction too, as you say.
Yeah.
Sometimes the startup's got to teach the investor
Yeah.
how to hands off a little bit and let them do their thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, being aware, really intentional about it, because you've got to articulate that, right? You've
Yeah.
got to be able to say, this is why we operate this way. This
Exactly.
is why we
Agree.
move fast and make decisions
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's got to be clear what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think we still got a couple minutes, Jens, do we?
Yeah, well, another 3-4 minutes, and then we switch over to Q&A.
Perfect. So this is right, Startup Grind, Women Leaders Month. So talk to us a little bit just about kind of you and your experience as a woman in tech. I want you to kind of layer into that, if you would,
Yeah.
the importance of diversity in
Yeah.
being agile. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about your story of being a woman in tech.
Well, by now I will call it an advantage, but it was definitely a journey. Being often the only woman. Officially, I also have actually no technical background. By training, I'm a journalist. I think, being a woman in IT is about gender diversity. I think just diversity in general is so important. If you think again about, you want to bring up this product that is relevant, you need to have a diverse set of opinions. And sadly, there's just not that company culture to look at it like that. Too often it's seen as I must have at least one woman in IT, like a check in the box. And too often we end up in the more softer roles, which of course has to do with training and the influx of talent that I understand. It's a reality. I think it's sad. I have decided for myself that I think it's an advantage. But I think as a company, if you want to make that difference, if you want to, put all that effort in agile transformation and create these products, then equally important is diversity. If everybody around the table, often in my experience, is a white male with the same educational backgrounds, then you're going to get same opinions on the table and same solution proposals on the table. You won't be creating a tactic like that. So I think diversity, gender diversity, is for me equally important in creating that different voice in the market. But I enjoy it. I actually really enjoy it. And I also like coaching my fellow female in IT and telling them it's an advantage. You are that different voice, so use it. Maybe adjust a little bit in how you bring it. But that's more my personality. I had to learn to scale down my extrovertness within IT. But yeah, I think as management, as it's not just agile, it's actually diversity of opinions and viewpoints.
Yeah, no, it is. It's and experiences and levels and functional diversity as well, right? Hearing all of the stakeholders, that's a tenet of agile, right? Is that ability to gather information from.
I think, for example, a classic here in the Hong Kong market is, with the fintech and all that booming, is they still seek people with a financial background. While, you want to build out also the tech part. So I have several friends who have, Silicon Valley experience, just not in the banking sector. And they find it really hard here to find their space in the fintech reality. So like really when you're building out teams and you're hiring, I think there really is a big focus point here in Hong Kong, looking at diversity and understanding that's building out your product, building out your agile transformation starts also with that. Yeah.
All right, and I'll mention it, age, right?
Oh, yes, sorry,
guys can still contribute, right? So, I've had a lot of companies look at me and doesn't matter all the experience I've got. They've just kind of said, no, we don't want somebody over 40.
Not millennial enough. Oh yeah, I didn't even think of that.
So, so that's definitely, part of the equation as well. So, well, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure there's a bunch of questions. We touched on a number of areas there. And of course, there's so much more we could talk about. So I think we'll have a chance to do some of that now. All right.
Yeah, thank you. I just switch everybody over so I can see you all in gallery view. And I see a couple of friends